History often misses the quiet hands that moved the knights. We picture solitary heroes in shining armor, but their legendary deeds were often guided by women working from the shadows. This journey uncovers 21 specific moments when these women secretly redirected the course of chivalry, giving you a completely new understanding of medieval power. You will discover how a queen's whisper could launch a crusade, how a forged message from a lady could save a kingdom, and how a nun's deception could rescue a knight from certain death. These stories reveal that influence is not always about public command, but about private strategy and unseen courage. What does it truly mean to be the power behind the throne? Her gaze swept across the tournament field, a cool assessment amid the roaring chaos. She was not watching for the most spectacular lance strike or the loudest cheer from the common folk. Her eyes were fixed on one specific knight, a man of decent skill but more importantly of uncertain loyalty. Securing him was the true objective of the day. Queens like Elena of Aquitaine were masters of this subtle art. They did not merely rule from their thrones, they built networks of power one knight at a time, acting as the ultimate patrons and political architects. Historian Dr. Lena Schmidt observes that a queen's favor could launch a knight's career, but her disfavor could end it just as swiftly. This was influence exercised with quiet precision. A queen could place a trusted knight in command of a key castle garrison, ensuring her own safety and control over a region. She could nominate him for a delicate diplomatic mission to a rival court, where his success would directly strengthen her political standing. This patronage was the engine of a knight's rise. It involved the granting of lucrative lands, the arrangement of a strategic marriage to a wealthy heiress, and providing the substantial financial backing necessary for a man to equip himself, his war horses, and his personal retinue of soldiers. Consider the queen who casually suggests a particular knight is the only man brave enough for a perilous quest. The public sees a volunteer for glory, while in reality, the queen has just maneuvered her own agent into a position to seize a crucial asset or eliminate a hidden threat. How often do we look at a knight's ascent and attribute it solely to his strength and courage, completely missing the royal hand that guided his every step? The grand chessboard of medieval politics was, more often than we know, moved by a queen's patient strategy. Yet this public form of power had a more intimate, and in some ways more dangerous, counterpart operating in the shadows of castle corridors. The queen's public chessboard was one thing, but a far more personal game unfolded in the private libraries of great estates. Here, a young heiress, her inheritance hanging by a thread, would meet her chosen champion not in a sunlit throne room, but in the flickering shadows of torchlight. Her secret council consisted of one man, the knight she had personally selected to defend everything she owned. This was a profound, clandestine partnership. While she possessed the legal right to the land, she lacked the martial strength to hold it against ruthless rivals. He had the strength, but without the lands and titles she could bestow, he would remain just another swordsman for hire. In those hushed meetings, she did not simply give him orders, she gave him power. She transferred authority, granting him command over her guards and the loyalty of her household. She provided the deep, crucial intelligence that no outsider could possess, the hidden paths through her forests, the weaknesses in the castle's own defenses, and the personal vendettas and secret alliances of every nobleman who coveted her title. This knowledge transformed him. He was no longer just a fighter, he was a strategic defender, his every move informed by her mind. His victories on the battlefield were, in truth, the direct result of her guidance from the library. Consider the immense power embedded in a woman's property rights during this era. For a landless knight, becoming the champion of a wealthy heiress was the ultimate opportunity, a chance to secure his own legacy. But his destiny was not his own to command. It was irrevocably tied to her need for agency and protection. His path to glory was, in fact, a route she had meticulously charted on a map of her own ancestral lands. This silent collaboration between a woman's legal standing and a knight's martial skill created a formidable force, one that shaped the fate of entire regions from behind closed doors. A sealed parchment could carry more than orders. It could carry a woman's desperate gamble for survival. Within a besieged castle, cut off from the world, a lady of the house might learn that a relief force led by a powerful knight was approaching. But the message from her own lord, perhaps her husband or father, contained instructions she knew would lead to their doom, ordering the knight to attack a heavily fortified position head-on. Faced with this, she made a choice that would redefine treason. In the privacy of her chambers, she would break the seal, alter the message, and create a new set of orders, all with a steady hand. She might use a stolen seal ring pressed into warm wax, or command the absolute loyalty of a servant willing to risk their life to carry the forgery through enemy lines. The knight, receiving what he believed was a direct command from his liege lord, would then change his entire strategy. He would march to a different location, set an ambush in a narrow pass, or strike at the enemy's vulnerable supply train instead of their main force. His military genius, celebrated in the songs, was in fact a response to a script written in secret. He rode into a pivotal battle he never anticipated, his path cleverly rerouted by a mind he never knew was guiding him. This was not a passive prisoner waiting for rescue. This was an active commander manipulating the battlefield from her turret room. It forces us to wonder how many famous knightly victories were actually orchestrated by a woman's hand, her name lost to history while the knight received the glory. Her act walked a razor's edge, for if discovered, it would be called treason, but if it succeeded, it would be hailed as salvation. The fate of every soul within those stone walls, and the destiny of the knight himself, rested entirely on the success of her silent, solitary deception. This quiet war of words and wax reveals a deeper truth, that the greatest weapon in a castle's arsenal was sometimes not the knight's sword, but a lady's pen. The scent of crushed herbs and old honey filled the quiet infirmary, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the battlefield. A knight lay feverish, his body burning from a wound the monks had already given up for lost. They saw only the blackening flesh and the inevitable march toward a funeral mass. But the woman moving silently through the shadows saw something else entirely, a problem to be solved with the contents of her woven basket. Her knowledge was a living library, passed from mother to daughter for generations, a deep understanding of plants like yarrow to staunch bleeding, and the potent antimicrobial power of clean honey to fight infection. While the learned monks debated humors and prayed for a miracle, she acted, mixing her poultice with a practiced hand. The knight, drifting in and out of consciousness, would never know her name or the source of the cool relief that spread across his inflamed skin, drawing out the poison and allowing his body to finally mend. His survival was not a miracle, it was science applied by a hand history would never record. He would rise from that cot to earn more glory on the field, his entire future, and the battles he would yet win, a direct result of her quiet intervention. This hidden world of women's medicine was a critical pillar supporting the very idea of knighthood. How many celebrated careers were quietly extended by decades thanks to an apothecary's unseen remedy? The narrative that only the battlefield surgeon with his brutal tools determined a knight's fate is a profound oversimplification. Often, it was the keeper of nature's pharmacy, working in the peaceful hush of a monastery garden, who truly held the power over life and death. The strength of a knight was not just in his muscle and bone, but in the resilience granted to him by an anonymous guardian of ancient wisdom. While such healers mended the physical body, another kind of woman was mastering the art of mending a knight's spirit, operating within the sacred and surprisingly political space of the convent. The gentle strum of a lute and a poet's soaring voice could mask a command more effectively than any whispered conversation in a secret passage. In the sunlit grandeur of a courtly hall, a noblewoman would listen as her commissioned troubadour performed the latest ballad. To the assembled lords and ladies, it was a beautiful, if somewhat conventional, tale of unrequited love and distant quests. But for one knight, seated quietly among the audience, the flowery verses were a detailed set of instructions. The lady, unable to send a sealed letter without arousing suspicion, had instead woven a secret code into the song's very fabric. A mention of a silver ford in the third stanza was not poetic imagery, it was a precise geographic location for a rendezvous. A lament about a raven circling a lonely tower was not a metaphor for sorrow. It was a clear warning about a specific enemy outpost and its watchful guards. The knight, having been previously briefed on the cipher, would listen with an intensity that belied his relaxed posture. His next campaign, his very route through hostile territory, was being composed for him in real time, set to music and delivered in plain sight. This was the ultimate subversion of courtly love, a system that often placed women on symbolic pedestals. Here, a woman stepped down from that pedestal not to speak plainly, but to conduct an orchestra of intrigue, using the expectations of romance to execute a cold, hard strategy. The troubadour himself might never know he was a messenger, believing only that he had pleased a generous patron with his art. The knight would ride out the next day, his mission guided not by a shouted order, but by a melody he could still hear in his mind. It makes you listen to those old romantic ballads differently, doesn't it? How many of them were not expressions of heartache, but sophisticated delivery systems for secrets, their true meaning lost to us now, heard only by the knight for whom they were intended. This elegant deception reveals that a woman's most powerful tool could sometimes be a work of art, a weapon that left no scar but could alter the fate of a kingdom. The gleam of new plate armor was not just a reflection of the sun, it was the visible proof of a silent business transaction. While noble patrons backed knights for glory and land, a different kind of deal was being struck in the counting houses of wealthy merchant widows. These women, often left in control of vast commercial fortunes, understood that influence could be purchased as easily as silk or spice. She would observe a knight of obvious skill and ambition, a man whose spirit was hamstrung by his threadbare surcoat and aging, sway-backed horse. She saw past his current poverty to the potential return on an investment. Her offer was not a charitable gift, it was a contract. The funds she provided for a custom-fitted suit of armor from the best smith, for a powerful, trained warhorse, and for the retinue of squires and men at arms required for his station, were a form of venture capital. This financial injection transformed him from a nobody into a contender. He could now travel to the major tournaments, where victories meant not only prizes but priceless reputation. He could present himself as a man of substance, worthy of a lord's notice and a strategic marriage. His entire social and military ascent was built upon the foundation of her economic foresight. In return, she acquired something money could not usually buy: the unwavering loyalty of a rising military power. This knight now owed his entire existence as a formidable force to her judgment. When her trade caravans needed protection from bandits, his men would provide the escort. When a rival merchant family made a threatening political move, her knight would be there to counter it, his influence in court serving as her shield. His sword arm had, in effect, become an extension of her ledger books. How many knights celebrated for their self-made rise were, in reality, the product of a woman's brilliant portfolio management. The clinking of coins in a strongbox could be just as decisive as the clanging of swords in a melee, proving that economic power, quietly wielded from a merchant's house, could redirect the very course of chivalry. This financial web was one layer of a much larger system, a network of information where the most valuable currency was not gold, but a carefully whispered secret. The heavy oak door of the convent infirmary groaned shut, sealing the outside world away. Inside, the only sounds were the soft rustle of a nun's habit and the ragged breathing of the man she had just hidden among the truly ill. His surcoat was stained with more than mud, and the pursuit was closing in. To record him as a knight would be a death sentence for them both, so, with a calm hand, she inscribed a new identity for him in the ledger, a false name listed as a pilgrim too sick for travel or a distant cousin taken in for Christian charity. This was not merely an act of mercy, it was a high-stakes performance of piety. She banked on the superstitious dread most soldiers held for violating consecrated ground. A searching lord might demand entry, but his men-at-arms would hesitate to ransack an altar or overturn a nun's cot, fearing divine retribution. Her deception weaponized their very faith against them, creating a sanctuary where none should exist. The knight, his wounds slowly knitting back together under her care, was granted a future he had already lost. His recovery in that quiet room was not just physical, it was a resurrection of his destiny. The battle he would later win, the castle he would later hold, the lineage he would later found, all became possible because a woman in a convent chose to record a lie in a book. This highlights a clandestine network operating across Christendom, where religious women provided crucial way stations for the turning gears of history. How many pivotal moments, how many survived kings and preserved kingdoms, relied entirely on the courage of a nun who looked at a wounded man and decided that her higher duty was to deceive. Her vow of obedience was to a higher authority than any secular lord, and in that space she found the moral room to become a savior of knights and a silent architect of the world outside her walls. While such sacred deception saved lives, a different kind of woman was learning to save entire economies from ruin, proving that a widow's management of a fallen lord's estate was its own form of battlefield command. The knight stood ready to depart, his saddlebags packed with official scrolls and formal credentials. He believed he was prepared for the delicate negotiations ahead. But the most critical document he would carry existed only in the mind of the noblewoman who intercepted him in the castle's quiet anteroom. She had spent her youth at that foreign court, observing the subtle dance of power that official missives never captured. In a hushed, urgent tone, she laid out the true landscape he was about to enter. She warned him that the Grand Chamberlain, though publicly loyal, secretly despised the king's favorite and could be swayed with a carefully worded promise. She revealed that the queen valued gifts of rare manuscripts far above gold, and that mentioning a certain northern poet would instantly endear him to her. Most crucially, she identified a simmering border lord whose loyalty was for sale, a man completely absent from the knight's formal briefing. This was not gossip, it was strategic intelligence. The knight arrived at the foreign court no longer a simple messenger reciting lines. He was an operative. He knew which doors to knock on, which smiles were genuine, and which flatteries would yield the greatest return. When he skillfully brokered a treaty that secured a vital alliance for his kingdom, the chroniclers recorded his diplomatic brilliance. They did not record the woman's voice in that shadowy room, the voice that had handed him the key to every lock he would encounter. His success was a performance, but she had written the script. How many celebrated peace treaties were actually forged in those confidential conversations long before the diplomats ever met? This demonstrates that a woman's influence often resided in her role as a living archive, a keeper of secrets and relationships that could make or break the most important political missions. The power behind the throne was very often the memory in the anteroom. A broken heart can forge a more potent weapon than any siege engine. In one noble household, a lady found herself cast aside by a powerful lord for a more politically advantageous match. Her affection curdled into a cold, calculating fury. She learned through her own network of loyal servants that this same lord had laid a meticulous ambush for a knight loyal to a rival house. The trap was set in a narrow mountain pass, a perfect kill box. Her motivation was not to save the knight, but to wound the lord who had wounded her. She dispatched her most trusted maid with a coded message, a seemingly innocent letter to a fictional aunt that contained the precise details of the ambush, the location, and the number of soldiers involved. The knight receiving this inexplicable warning was at first suspicious, yet the intelligence was too specific, too accurate to ignore. He rerouted his entire force, avoiding the pass entirely, and instead circling around to attack the lord's now undefended supply camp. The ambushing force, waiting in vain, was left exposed and strategically useless. The knight celebrated victory that day, the supplies he captured, the blow he dealt to his enemy. All of it was a direct consequence of a personal betrayal he knew nothing about. His survival and triumph were merely the byproducts of a woman's desire for revenge. This reveals a startling truth that the grand, impersonal forces of medieval warfare were often set in motion by the most intimate of human emotions. A jilted lover's message, carried by a single servant on a lonely road, could redirect the flow of history as decisively as a king's decree. The knight rode on, his legend growing, completely unaware that his path had been cleared by the scorched earth of a ruined courtship. The scratch of a quill on parchment was the only sound in the silent scriptorium, a quiet that belied its immense power. Here, far from the cacophony of the battlefield, a female scribe bent over her work, her task not just to record history but to shape it. She listened as a knight's retainer recounted the day's events, his lord having wavered for a crucial moment before a charge. That hesitation, a perfectly human flicker of fear, was a detail the knight's reputation could not survive. So, with a deliberate stroke, she did not record it. Instead, she amplified his eventual recovery, describing a calculated pause to rally his men, transforming a moment of weakness into one of strategic command. This was not a simple lie, it was historical alchemy. Her altered chronicle became the official record, the only version future bards would sing and chroniclers would copy. The knight's legacy, and by extension the legacy of his entire family line, was being forged not in the heat of combat, but in the cool, deliberate ink of her part. This crafted reputation had direct, tangible consequences. A king, reading this glowing account years later, might be moved to grant the knight's son a lucrative parcel of land, convinced of the family's unwavering bravery. A powerful lord, seeking a match for his daughter, would see this paragon of chivalry as the ideal father for his future grandchildren. The entire social and economic future of a knightly house could hinge on a few sentences composed by a woman whose name would never appear in the ledger. It forces us to reconsider the very foundation of the chivalric ideal we have inherited. How many of the flawless heroes in our history books are the meticulous creations of an anonymous editor, a woman who understood that controlling the present narrative was the only way to command the future's memory. A knight's immortality was often a gift carefully granted by a scribe's discerning hand. The clang of steel in the training yard was a familiar music, but the most important lesson was learned in the quiet of the garden. A knight's foster mother, a noblewoman of a minor but ancient house, watched the boy's formal drills with a critical eye. She saw the gaps in his instruction, the predictable patterns that every other knight was taught. One evening, she called him away from his master at arms. What she offered him was not a lesson in courtly manners, but a piece of her own family's legacy, a unique sword-fighting technique guarded for generations. It might have been a specific, unconventional grip that allowed for a faster recovery after a parry, or a subtle defensive stance that presented a deceptively small target. This was not knowledge from a combat manual. It was a living secret passed from mother to foster son in the twilight, far from the approving eyes of his official tutors. Years later, that knight stood on the field of a trial by combat, facing a larger, more experienced opponent who knew every standard move in the chivalric playbook. As the fight wore on, the knight fell back into the familiar rhythm of his training, and his adversary anticipated every thrust. Then, in a desperate moment, he remembered the garden. He shifted his grip just so, his body falling into that unnatural stance. His opponent, confused by this unfamiliar geometry of combat, hesitated for a single, fatal heartbeat. That was all the knight needed. His victory was sudden, shocking, and immediately legendary. The chroniclers would write of his divine favor and unparalleled skill, never knowing the true source of his edge. His defining moment, the triumph that secured his name in history, was not born in the public yard but in the private, trusting space a woman had created. This forces a profound reconsideration of where a knight's power truly originated. We assume martial knowledge was a chain passed solely from father to son and master to squire, a closed loop of male instruction. But here, the signature move that saved a life and forged a legacy was a mother's secret gift. It reveals the domestic sphere as a hidden academy, where the most battle-altering skills could be a whispered inheritance. Each stitch in the tapestry was a calculated act of defiance. A noblewoman, held as a gilded hostage in a foreign castle, requested her loom and threads, a request her captors saw as a harmless concession to a lady's boredom. They believed she was weaving a scene of pastoral idleness, but under her fingers, a detailed map of the fortress was taking shape. The winding blue river in the background was not a river at all, but a perfect representation of the castle's hidden aqueduct system, a network large enough for a man to crawl through. The intricate pattern of roses climbing a trellis secretly charted the patrol routes of the guards on the western wall, the thorns indicating the timing of their rotations. This was textile espionage, a masterpiece of concealed intelligence. The completed tapestry was then smuggled out, perhaps folded within a bundle of laundry or hidden in a merchant's cart, eventually reaching the knights who were desperately planning her rescue. The knight leading the assault would have studied this cloth map by candlelight, memorizing the pathways she had so carefully encoded. His subsequent, celebrated infiltration of the impregnable fortress was not a story of brute force. It was a story of precise navigation. He and his men slipped through the aqueduct she had mapped, avoided the patrols whose schedules she had documented, and emerged in the inner courtyard without raising an alarm. His heroic rescue, the stuff of ballads, was a direct execution of a plan she had drafted on her loom. Her creative resistance transformed a domestic craft into an instrument of liberation. The knight provided the muscle and the courage, but she provided the eyes, using the only tools her captors allowed her to possess. This forces us to reconsider the very definition of a rescue. Was the knight saving the lady, or was he the final, moving piece in a strategic game she had already set in motion from her prison? A knight's triumphant entry was, in more than one instance, guided not by a scout's report, but by the deliberate, silent patterns in a woman's art. The chill of the observatory tower was a stark contrast to the warmth of the council chamber below. While his fellow knights argued over troop numbers and supply lines, he stood in silence, listening to the astrologer trace the slow dance of celestial bodies on her star chart. Her instruction was not a suggestion, but a command born of the cosmos, to march his men under the dark of the new moon and to wait for his moment not at dawn, but in the precise hour when Mars crossed the path of Saturn. To any seasoned commander, it was madness, a forfeiture of light and tactical advantage for the sake of ancient superstition. Yet he trusted her. He led his small force on a grueling night march along a treacherous goat path she had specified, a route that bypassed the main enemy encampment entirely. They arrived exhausted at a secluded valley just as the first sliver of moon reappeared, and found the enemy's command tent utterly unguarded, its leaders confident in their own conventional wisdom. The knight's surprise attack was not a battle, it was a capture, a bloodless victory that ended a campaign before it could truly begin. His fellow commanders would later call it incredible luck. But it was not luck, it was faith, a faith placed in a woman's interpretation of a silent, starry language. This reveals a hidden layer of medieval strategy, where the map of the heavens was consulted as seriously as any map of the land. A knight's courage was not just measured by his willingness to face steel, but by his willingness to trust an unseen logic, to follow a path illuminated not by the sun, but by a woman's celestial calculations. His celebrated intuition was, in fact, her foresight. The clinking of tankards and the raucous laughter of soldiers masked the most valuable currency in the room: information. The innkeeper's wife moved through the crowded tavern with a practiced smile, refilling ale and wiping tables, her ears tuned to every slurred boast and careless complaint. To the knights and lords planning their campaigns in distant castles, these common soldiers were just numbers on a roster, but to her, they were unwitting messengers. One evening, a group of them, deep in their cups, began complaining about a forced night march planned for the following week, grumbling about a specific wooded valley they were meant to traverse. She absorbed the details, the location, the number of men, their intended formation. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, she whispered it all to a traveling tinker, a man she knew to be a reliable messenger for a certain knight who had once shown her family kindness. That knight, loyal to a lord opposed to these very soldiers, received the tinker's report. The intelligence was raw, unpolished, and perfect. It allowed him to set a perfect ambush in that wooded valley, catching the enemy force strung out and unprepared in a narrow pass. His celebrated tactical victory, the capture of supplies and high-ranking officers, was directly enabled by a woman who never held a sword. This was intelligence gathering from the ground up, a system that operated entirely outside the formal spy networks of the nobility. Her tavern was not just a business, it was a listening post, and her sharp mind was the filter that separated useless gossip from battlefield-altering facts. How many knightly triumphs credited to brilliant scouting were actually handed to them on a platter by a common woman whose name was never deemed important enough to write down? His victory was toasted with ale in great halls, while the woman who made it possible poured another round in her smoky tavern, her contribution as vital as it was invisible. Laughter echoed through the great hall, a roaring wave that crested with the jester's final cartwheel. She was the court fool, a woman whose motley and bells granted her the license to say what no one else dared. Her latest target was the visiting lord, a man of immense power and a carefully constructed reputation for piety. She mimicked his overly solemn prayers, then tripped and landed at the feet of a particular knight, a man known for his rigid honor. Giggling, she pointed a bladder on a stick at the lord and declared in a sing-song voice, "Oh, what a heavy cross he bears, so much heavier than the gold he hides beneath it." The hall erupted in fresh mirth, taking it as pure nonsense, but the knight did not laugh. He heard the strange precision in her words. The jester's performance was a masterclass in coded satire, her buffoonery a perfect disguise for a lethal accusation. While others saw a fool, he saw a key. Her joke about hidden gold was not random. It was a specific, veiled reference to a clandestine payment, a bribe for a future betrayal. The knight, now suspicious, began a quiet investigation. He followed the thread she had handed him, discovering that the pious lord was indeed amassing a private army with foreign coin, planning to seize the very castle they stood in. The conspiracy was thwarted, the traitor exposed, all because a woman had weaponized her laughter. Her courage, cloaked in absurdity, allowed her to speak a truth that would have meant a death sentence for anyone else. The knight celebrated vigilance. His uncovering of the plot was a direct result of his willingness to listen to the fool. This reveals satire as a sophisticated shield, a way for the seemingly powerless to arm themselves with wit. A knight's greatest defense was sometimes not his sword, but his ability to decipher the dangerous message hidden within a jester's rhyme. Her feet knew the path better than any scout's map ever could. She was a refugee, her village just ashes and memory, but the landscape was etched into her mind with the clarity of survival. When the knight's army, large and loud and lost, blundered near the forest where she and her children were hiding, she made a desperate bargain. She offered him a secret, the knowledge of a goat trail that twisted up the seemingly impassable cliff face, a route only used by local shepherds. In return, she asked for the one thing she no longer possessed: safety. The knight, frustrated by the blocked main passes and his dwindling supplies, had little to lose by trusting her. He ordered his men to follow the gaunt, determined woman. She led them not as a soldier, but as a guide, pointing out the single fordable point in a river that appeared too deep and swift to cross, showing them where to find fresh water springs hidden by thorny brush. Her local knowledge, born from a life lived on that land, became his army's greatest weapon. The strategic surprise was total. The enemy, confident in the natural fortress of the mountains, was completely unprepared for an assault from the rear. The knight's celebrated flanking maneuver, the one that decided the entire campaign, was not a product of his own scouting. It was a gift from a woman who had lost everything except the geographic memory of her home. His tactical genius was, in fact, a refugee's intimate recall of where the rocks were stable and the water was shallow. It forces a humbling thought that the grand designs of kings and commanders were often executed with intelligence provided by those they were supposedly fighting to protect. The most brilliant campaign map was sometimes just the remembered footsteps of a woman fleeing for her life. The truth was a dangerous burden she was forced to carry in silence. She had seen it all from her cottage window, the masked men setting the fire, the crest of a rival lord clearly visible on one man's surcoat before he pulled up his hood. But when the knight was accused of burning his own estate for the insurance, a lie spread by that very same rival, the men came to her door. Their message was not a request, it was a threat, spoken in low tones that promised violence to her and her children if she ever spoke of what she saw. Publicly, she obeyed, her silence in the courtroom seeming to confirm the knight's guilt. His lands were forfeited, his name blackened, but her conscience would not let the truth die. In the absolute secrecy of the confessional, she whispered every detail to a trusted priest, the cloth of the screen both a shield and a witness. Or perhaps she sought out a sympathetic scribe, one known for his discretion, and dictated a full account, a document to be sealed and hidden away for a future day of reckoning. This was not an act of immediate justice, but of profound faith, a belief that the written word could outlive the memory of men and the reach of their swords. She was planting a seed in the darkest soil, hoping it would one day find the light. Years later, long after she herself had passed, that sealed testimony was discovered during an unrelated investigation. The priest's private records were reviewed, or the scribe's hidden strongbox was finally opened. The single, sworn account, dated from the very week of the crime, laid out the entire conspiracy with chilling clarity. The knight, living in exile and disgrace, was summoned back to court. His honor was restored, his lands returned, his family legacy snatched back from the brink of oblivion. His entire redemption was built upon the courage of a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, a witness who ensured that her silence in public was not the final word. A knight's legacy, it turns out, could be resurrected from a single page, written in secret and preserved by the one person brave enough to tell the truth when no one was allowed to hear it. The vibrant beauty of the castle gardens concealed a quiet war. While others admired the blossoms, the gardener saw the subtle language of decay in a knight's fading complexion. His slow decline, mistaken for a wasting sickness by the court physicians, was to her the unmistakable signature of a rare, slow-acting poison, likely introduced drop by drop into his wine or meals. She recognized the telltale signs in the yellowing of his eyes and the specific tremor in his hands, knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that every plant held a dual nature, capable of both cure and kill. From a hidden corner of her plot, she harvested the roots and leaves for a potent antidote, brewing it into a bitter tonic she presented as a simple herbal remedy for fatigue. Her daily administrations were a silent counter-offensive, each dose pulling him back from the brink. As the fog lifted from his mind and strength returned to his limbs, the knight realized his illness was no natural affliction. Her healing gave him the clarity to become a detective in his own house, watching for the hand that slipped the toxin into his cup. His survival and his subsequent exposure of the rival within his own circle was a victory she cultivated as surely as her roses. The gravest threat had not been a rival army at the gate, but a trusted companion at the dinner table, and the most decisive defense was a woman's knowledge, quietly mixed into a morning draft. This intimate betrayal reveals that a knight's greatest peril often walked the same hallways, and his ultimate shield was sometimes the watchful eye of a woman who knew the secrets of the soil. The harbormaster's log recorded a routine delay for repairs, a simple lie that saved a kingdom. While the city gates shuddered under the enemy's battering ram, a widow who owned the last seaworthy merchant vessel in port gave the order to her captain. The ship was ready, the cargo loaded, but she commanded them to wait, to fabricate an issue with the rigging that would require a full day to mend. This was not a business decision, it was a military one. She knew a specific knight, a commander whose strategic mind was irreplaceable, was trapped inside the walls with his retinue. Her control over maritime logistics created a lifeline that official channels could not. As panic spread through the streets, a discreet messenger found the knight, telling him of a ship held back by fortune, waiting at the far quay. The knight and his men fought their way to the docks, seeing the delayed vessel not as a coincidence but as a miracle. They boarded just as the final defenses were breached, watching the burning city recede from the deck. He would live to rally the scattered royal forces, to become the linchpin of a resistance that eventually reclaimed the land. His legendary escape, his subsequent victories, all hinged on a widow's deliberate manipulation of a shipping schedule. She wielded her economic authority like a general, understanding that the movement of goods and people was the true circulatory system of any war. His survival was not a matter of chance, it was a carefully managed transaction, a passage booked by a woman who knew that the most powerful weapon could sometimes be a patiently waiting ship. A dusty sunbeam cut across the stone floor of the schoolroom, illuminating the patient face of his tutor as she explained an ancient text. To the young squire, her lessons on mercy and the laws of honorable combat felt like abstract philosophy, distant from the raw clash of steel he trained for each afternoon. She spoke of Roman generals who showed clemency to build lasting peace, and of the spiritual duty to see the humanity in a vanquished foe. These ideas settled deep within him, becoming the quiet bedrock of his character, long before he ever faced the true test of a battlefield. Years later, that knight stood over a defeated rival noble, his sword poised for the final blow. The man's capture would be a great prize, but his death would be simpler, a permanent end to a bitter feud. In that crucial heartbeat, it was not the roar of the crowd or the advice of his marshals he heard, but the calm, measured voice of his tutor, questioning the true cost of a vengeful victory. He lowered his sword and ordered the nobleman's wounds tended. This act of calculated mercy seemed to some of his men a dangerous weakness. The decision, however, planted a seed of debt in the heart of his former enemy. Months later, when the knight's own forces were trapped and outmaneuvered, a lone rider approached his camp under a flag of truce. It was the same nobleman, repaying his life with a critical warning of an impending ambush, information that allowed the knight to escape a fatal trap and preserve his army. His celebrated tactical reversal was not born of any spy's report, but of a moral choice he had been prepared to make years before in a quiet schoolroom. The tutor's influence demonstrates that the most powerful weapon in a knight's arsenal was not always his strength, but his capacity for a strategic mercy taught by a woman who knew that true power lies in building futures, not just winning battles. While a tutor could shape a knight's soul for the long game, another woman's influence was felt in the immediate, desperate scramble for survival on the castle walls. The melody she plucked from her lute was a cheerful diversion, but her eyes were a surveyor's instrument, measuring every crack in the fortress wall. As a traveling minstrel, her access was unparalleled, welcomed into the heart of enemy holds for the price of a song. While lords and knights drank to her tunes, she was mentally cataloging everything a military scout could never see. She noted the sagging gate hinge that spoke of poor maintenance, the bored, inattentive shuffle of the night watch, and the exact location where the outer wall's mortar had crumbled away to nothing. Her performances were not just entertainment, they were active reconnaissance missions. After leaving the castle, she would not simply travel to the next town. She would find a prearranged meeting place, a quiet inn or a secluded crossroads, and there she would deliver her true performance, not for a crowd but for a single night. Her report was not a dry list of numbers, it was a vivid, sensory account. She could describe the sullen mood of the garrison, suggesting they were underfed and unlikely to put up a fierce resistance. She could pinpoint the exact hour when the guard change was at its most chaotic, creating a perfect window for a silent approach. The knight, receiving this intelligence, did not just have a map, he had a living portrait of his target's weaknesses. His subsequent assault was not a brutish test of strength against stone, it was a surgical strike. His men scaled the wall at the spot she had identified as poorly maintained. They slipped through the postern gate during the moment of confusion she had timed, and they found a garrison already demoralized by the very songs meant to lift their spirits. The minstrel's art had disarmed them long before the first sword was ever drawn. How many swift and bloodless victories were actually orchestrated by the woman who provided the evening's entertainment? Her lute case was her quiver, and every song was an arrow aimed at the heart of a fortress's complacency. The knight's triumph was a composition, but she had written every note, proving that the most effective spy could be the one everyone was paid to listen to. The final cipher was a masterpiece of misdirection, a seemingly innocent merchant's invoice for spices and silk. But the woman in the secluded chamber saw the pattern others had missed, the deliberate repetition of certain numbers that corresponded to letters in a foreign alphabet. While the king's advisors had dismissed the document as a commercial ledger, her patient work revealed its true nature, a detailed battle plan for a surprise attack at dawn through a hidden mountain pass. The enemy's entire strategy was laid bare on that single sheet of parchment. She did not rush to the throne room herself, for a woman's word on such matters could be too easily dismissed. Instead, she entrusted the decoded message to a sympathetic scribe, a man whose credibility was beyond question, with strict instructions on which knight, known for his swift action and tactical cunning, must receive it. That knight, forewarned and forearmed, did not merely reinforce his position. He used the enemy's own plan against them, moving his forces under cover of darkness to the very pass they intended to use, setting a devastating ambush that turned their moment of anticipated triumph into a rout. The ballads would forever sing of the knight's brilliant counterstroke, but they would never name the woman who handed him the enemy's playbook. Her intellectual victory in that quiet room was the true genesis of the battlefield's glory. This final, decisive moment solidifies a profound truth that echoes through all 21 of these stories. A knight's celebrated success was rarely a solitary achievement. It was the culmination of a hidden symphony of efforts, a collaborative tapestry woven from the courage, strategy, and intellect of women working from the shadows. The key to a kingdom's salvation was not always a stronger sword arm, but a sharper mind, patiently deciphering the code in a silent room. A clear pattern emerges from these 21 stories, a truth that reshapes our entire understanding of the chivalric age. The knight's destiny, so often portrayed as a solitary quest for glory, was in fact a deeply collaborative endeavor. From queens and heiresses to apothecaries and innkeepers, women were the silent architects of the very legends we celebrate today. They wielded a different kind of power, one born not from the sword but from wisdom, profound courage, and quiet cunning. These forgotten narratives fundamentally challenge the monolithic image of the armored warrior standing alone against the world. They reveal a far more complex and interesting medieval landscape, a world where power was constantly shared, strategically delegated, and most often deliberately hidden from view. History, then, is not merely the record of battles fought in the open sunlight. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, the chronicle of strategies conceived in the deepest secret, of plans whispered in castle anterooms and intelligence woven into the patterns of a tapestry. The next time your mind conjures the image of a knight in shining armor, pause for a moment and ask a simple question: who polished it? Let these stories of unsung heroines inspire you to look more deeply into every historical narrative you encounter. If this journey into the past's hidden corners has intrigued you, consider subscribing for more explorations that challenge what we think we know. And we would love to hear your own thoughts on these remarkable women in the comments.